Today I'm going to talk about the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. After the Bolshevik Revolution, and especially after the defeat of the Whites by the Bolsheviks in the Civil War, many Orthodox Christians, including clergy, emigrated. Formed as an alternative to the Moscow Patriarchate, free from the control of the godless Soviet state, the Church abroad became an independent ecclesiastical body. However, many different canonical and political issues, most importantly in the context of the relationship with the Church in Russia at different points of history, caused many splits and schisms. As a result of these processes, there are many Russian-speaking Orthodox churches and communities all over the world. It would take many hours and numerous videos to address them all. Today I'm only going to talk about the biggest, most important historically and most recognized church, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. This church has been recognized by the Moscow Patriarchate initially and has come back as a daughter church after the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, let's start from the beginning. The separation of the church started already in Russia, before the final wave of the so-called white emigration. After the Bolsheviks took over the capital city of Petrograd, the civil war broke out. The whites were not only represented by the supporters of the monarchy, but were very diverse politically. Most of the Orthodox Christians, however, were on the side of the whites, opposed to the communist and atheist Reds. While the church leadership was preoccupied with the restoration of Patriarchate in Moscow and eventual life under the Bolshevik rule, the eparchies under the white rule consolidated and supported the white forces in their fight against godless Bolsheviks. In 1919, in the city of Stavropol, a provisional church administration in southeast Russia was formed. Patriarch Tikhon authorized the administration shortly before communication was lost due to the raging civil war. While gradually losing to the Reds, not only military leaders, but also intellectuals, artists, writers, poets, musicians, nobility, and also the most active clergy in the white movement eventually left Russia. According to different calculations, from 1 to 5 million Russian citizens left Russia in different directions, from China to Germany. Some of them settled, some moved further and further, ending up all over the world. Initially, many active military or politically motivated people had plans and hopes to return to Russia, whether after the collapse of the Bolsheviks or even prepared to fight them. The emigrants consolidated in some big cities, for instance Paris, Berlin, Belgrade, or Harbin in China. The Church and the Orthodox faith played an important role in their communities, both symbolically and practically. The immigrants to Orthodox countries, such as Greece or Serbia, did not usually join the local churches and kept their loyalty to the Russian Orthodox Church. The provisional administration eventually became the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia by consolidating and declaring headship over most eparchies of the Russian Church abroad, with few exceptions that they did not control, such as Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states. In 1920, in the Serbian town of Sremski Karlovci, where the leadership of the Church abroad was settled, the immigrant Russian Orthodox clergy and laymen held a big council. The council practically launched the church outside of Russia. Most of its agenda was political, calling for the restoration of monarchy, defeat and removal of the Bolshevik regime, and also the establishment of the office of the Deputy Patriarch, held by Metropolitan Antoni Hrapovitsky. Under the tremendous pressure from the Soviet government and the threat of a criminal conviction with the real possibility of a death sentence, Patriarch Tikhon officially rejected the legitimacy of the council and ordered its dissolution. Tikhon referred to Metropolitan Yevlogy as an appointed representative of the church abroad. The council formally obeyed, but the movement has already been launched. After the council, the Church abroad organized a provisional bishops' synod with the mandatory participation of Metropolitan Yevlogi. Yevlogi refused to become the head of the Church, referring to the bishops' council as the main executive body. The council concluded that Patriarch Tikhon was under the control of the Soviet regime. Eventually, the representative of the Moscow Patriarchate, Metropolitan Yevlogi, distanced himself from the council and its head, Metropolitan Antony. Metropolitan Yevlogi remained an official head of the Moscow Patriarchate eparchies abroad until 1930, when he was removed from his position for his political activities by the patriarchal placeholder, future Patriarch Sergei. He joined the Constantinople Patriarchate, claiming that although he did not dare to criticize Sergei, he was unable to obey all his orders in a different political context abroad. In 1934-1935, under the mediation of Varnava, the Patriarch of Serbia, there were several attempts to make peace between Yevlogi and Antony. Although they managed to personally reconcile their conflict, the Church did not accept Yevlogi back without him acknowledging his guilt and repenting, and he refused those conditions. By the end of his life, he managed to formally return to the Moscow Patriarchate under the headship of Patriarch Alexei I. In 1927, the Church abroad finally broke the fellowship with Moscow after reading and discussing the declaration of Metropolitan Sergei, which called for the recognition and obedience to Soviet rule and called the Church abroad to do the same. The Moscow Patriarchate was considered under the control of the godless Soviet regime. Sergei, in turn, condemned the council, declared its activities a schism, and suspended its leaders in ministry, which they naturally did not recognize. Since then, and until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Church abroad did not recognize Russian patriarchs, considering them agents of Soviet power. The next important, controversial and tragic part of the Church's history abroad is the Second World War. When Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in Germany, there was a big Russian emigre community in Berlin. Competing with the Soviet Union over the influence in Europe, the Nazis saw an opportunity to gain some control over the Russian immigration through the Church. They took side of the Church abroad. In 1938, they confiscated church buildings belonging to the Moscow Patriarchate and gave them to the Church outside of Russia. The regime even bankrolled the construction of a new cathedral in Berlin. After the break of the Molotov-Ribbentrop peace deal and the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Nazi regime applied some pressure to the Russian Church abroad, but did not subject her to large-scale terror. In the occupied Soviet territories, the Nazi regime was supportive of religious activity, including the Orthodox Church. In 1943, the Church abroad did not recognize the election of Patriarch Sergei. This was received positively in Berlin, and eventually the Church was allowed to have a bishops' conference in Vienna to formalize the decision. The Church leadership evidently sided with the Nazis against the atheist Soviet regime. During the second part of the war, when the Red Army was advancing towards Germany, the leadership of the Church changed its base several times, from Belgrade to Vienna to Karlsbad in Czechoslovakia to Bavaria in Germany. The head of the Church, Metropolitan Anastasi, had several meetings with the traitor general Andrei Vlasov and gave his blessing to the creation of the Nazi collaborationist Russian Liberation Army. By the end of the war, the Moscow Patriarchate tried to gain control over the Church abroad. First, in 1945, the clergy in Belgrade rejoined the Church through formal repentance. Later the same year, Patriarch Alexei issued a call for repentance to the schismatics of Karlovac. Metropolitan Anastasi responded that the church in Russia was unfree and could not be trusted. However, a significant part of the foreign eparchies in the countries under the Soviet influence were restored in the Russian Church after the war. The Church abroad, in turn, welcomed numerous refugees and Nazi collaborators who did not want to return to the Soviet Union under the threat of death. Apart from Berlin and Vienna, the new center of Russian Orthodox immigration was established in the United States, the emerging superpower. This was enforced by a huge migration of former prisoners of wars, refugees and collaborators from Europe to the United States. Just like anywhere else, the Russian Orthodox community in the US was split over the issue of subordination. Initially a part of the church abroad, the diocese in the US in 1946 requested to be recognized as a part of the Moscow Patriarchate under the condition of their autonomy. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia and the North American diocese thus broke communion. The Moscow Patriarchate rejected the condition of autonomy under the pressure from the Soviet state and suspended its head, Metropolitan Theophil, from ministry. The diocese was left in isolation for nearly 25 years. The diocese underwent Americanization, gradually turning its services into the English language. Many of the faithful were second-generation migrants or local converts, that is, native English speakers. Those who wanted to preserve their Russian identity often transferred to the church outside of Russia. Eventually, with the active participation of the influential Soviet Metropolitan Nikodim, see a video about him on my channel, the diocese was given an autocephalous status under the pressure from the competing Constantinople Patriarchate, expanding its influence in the US. The diocese was renamed as the Orthodox Church in America. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia grew in numbers and influence. Under the influence of the religious immigrants from the Soviet Union, the Church attempted to establish contacts with the underground Orthodox churches, especially the so-called catacomb churches. The Moscow Patriarchate was perceived even more critically as totally controlled and loyal to the atheist state. Apart from Moscow, communion was broken with Orthodox churches in other socialist countries. At the same time, until the end of the Soviet regime, the Church experienced splits and minor schisms over canonical, political, and theological issues, for instance, the preservation of the old Julian calendar, ecumenism, or leadership of the Church. One of the main ideological responses to the Church in Russia was the canonization of the new saints. The Church was actively beatifying Christian leaders and martyrs, ideologically antagonistic to the Soviet regime. The most prominent ones were priest Ioan of Kronstadt, a very influential ultra-conservative cleric of the 19th century, and the whole pantheon of the new confessors and martyrs, that is, people prosecuted for their faith by the Soviet regime. Initially, there was no definitive list of people. Then, according to some scholarly accounts and reports in the Soviet propaganda, the list was being filled with names of prosecuted clerics beatified as confessors and martyrs executed for their faith. The most prominent names included Patriarch Tikhon, Metropolitan Seraphim, and the whole family of the abdicated monarch Nicholas II, executed in Yekaterinburg in 1918. The Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow would canonize most of the same people after the liberalization of religion in the late 1980s. However, when it comes to the imperial family, there was an interesting difference. The Moscow Church would only canonize the family members of Nicholas, but the Church abroad also beatified his whole household, who were also shot in the same basement, including even one Lutheran and one Catholic. The justification was that, unlike the family of the Tsar, his household followed their beloved master voluntarily. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Church abroad started negotiations with the Church in Moscow concerning the possible restoration of ties. However, in the 1990s, the movement within Russian parishes towards leaving the Moscow Church and joining the Church abroad became an obstacle to such negotiations. Many of such groups also conflicted with each other. The Russian Church naturally saw these splits as schisms. Eventually, all of the parishes returned to the Church. As for clerics, some of them repented and some left for other Christian communities. Eventually, after long negotiations, in 2007, the two churches represented by Patriarch Alexei II and Metropolitan Lavr signed an act on canonical fellowship. According to the act, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was recognized as an autocephalous church under the Moscow Patriarchate. The church is autonomous in most of her affairs, but the election of the church head and changes in the canonical territory should be approved by the Patriarch of Moscow. Naturally, some of the leaders, parishes, and the faithful refused to recognize the reconciliation with Moscow and split from the church. 2 years later, in 2009, the church outside of Russia and already subject to Moscow, the Orthodox Church in America, also restored their canonical fellowship. Currently, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia is centered in New York, with the main cathedral of Our Lady of the Sign in Manhattan. It is headed by Metropolitan Nicholas. Despite the strong connection to Moscow and an emphasis on preservation of pre-revolutionary Russian Orthodox liturgy and tradition, the church includes many local converts. For instance, one of the influential clerics with a large online following is Father Moses McPherson from the Holy Mother of God Church in Texas. So, what can we make of the history of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia? Despite the noble mission of consolidating Russian Orthodox believers forced to leave their motherland but still willing to practice the faith of their forefathers, the Church did not succeed. Most of the politically active Orthodox emigration was a part of the Church at some point, but constant divisions, splits, discords, struggles for power and influence, and eventual schisms testify to the failure of the consolidation of the Russian emigration in the 20th century by the Church. Another dark stain on the reputation of the Church is her evident collaboration with the Nazi regime, beyond mere obedience in Germany and the occupied territories. On the bright side, the Church outside of Russia managed to preserve the pre-revolutionary Orthodox faith, liturgy, tradition, and the memory of the countless victims of Soviet terror, holy confessors and martyrs of the Russian Orthodox Church. Please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all next time.